My name is Pat Morris, and I work with Development and Training Services, and I'm the director of the Gender and Social Inclusion practice area. And we are currently working on an assessment for DRL, looking at how well they have been including marginalized populations in their work. And so they asked us to come in and to share with you some tips on how to do that as you look at submitting proposals for funding for work that you would be doing to support the goals and objectives that the department has. Okay. So, as you see from the quote that we have up there, that there's a clear understanding on the part of the international community that social inclusion of marginalized groups is really central to human rights and economic development and overall, sustainable and equitable development around the world. There are a couple of reasons why inclusion matters. One is the whole, social justice, human rights argument, if you will. And if we certainly believe that, particularly in terms of doing our democracy and rights and labor work, that everyone should be included, then that becomes a major focus for us. And we also know that very often when we're looking at democratization work, when we're looking at rights work, that they are groups that are excluded from these processes. Their voices aren't heard, their rights aren't recognized, and so it becomes important then for us to include them in the work that we do. There are also other costs of exclusion, if you will. The absence of voice, key perspectives from particular groups are not included, particularly in decision making. As a result of that, we often see conflict and instability, most often anywhere around the world today where you see that there is conflict and instability. A lot of it has to do with particular groups not having a voice in the democratic processes. There are also personal costs. Some research have shown that people who suffer from discrimination and marginalization also have higher mental, emotional, and health problems as well, that also then have a particular impact on development and the cost of a lack of development. DRL in 2012 adopted the language that you see on the screen in the section on quality of program idea. And here they are suggesting that all programs, right, should at least investigate ways that you can be inclusive of these groups, right? So DRL is striving to ensure that the programs advance the rights and dignity of the most at risk and vulnerable populations. Here, they're focusing on women, people with disabilities, racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And so what they're saying is they very much want to be sure that the programming that they're funding and supporting, the programming that you would do, that you would implement, take into consideration the rights and uphold the dignity of these groups. They are also saying that you should identify considerations that support these populations in all of your proposed programs, activities, and in the overall objectives of your programming. As such, there is 5 additional points that are awarded to projects that support the inclusion of marginalized populations in terms of the whole evaluation and selection process. In addition, DRL also requires that you also monitor and evaluate how well then you are including marginalized populations in the programming that you've been funded to do. They want you to track and disaggregate data of participants by sex, so how many women, how many men, many males, females, and also to address issues affecting other traditionally marginalized groups. So looking at, how many disabled folks may be involved in the program, or LGBTI persons, or ethnic or religious minorities. It would really depend on the particular context, and the groups that are marginalized in, the country context that you're working in, which ones you would be looking at. But the whole idea is that where it's applicable and where it's appropriate, that you would include indicators that measure your support for issues that affect marginalized populations. And here, 1 point is awarded to projects that meet this requirement. So what are we talking about when we're talking about inclusion? And there are basically two, if you will, twin tracks to inclusion. One way is to integrate marginalized people into your broader program, all right? The other is to have very specific standalone programs that target a particular or a set of marginalized populations. In doing the first one, which is the box on the top, the integration of marginalized people into a broader program, say perhaps an elections program, right? What you then do is you are promoting equality, because you are making sure that both the marginalized group and the majority groups are all, benefiting from the services, the skills, the access, whatever the case may be, that the program is providing. On the other hand, when you have the specific programs that improve the ability or opportunity or dignity of a marginalized group, then you are focusing on the empowerment of that particular group. And both equality and empowerment are, of course, mutually reinforcing, outcomes that get us to this goal of social inclusion. So what are some questions that you may want to ask yourself in terms of doing a project design within your proposal to address this objective of including marginalized populations in the programs that you're proposing? A couple of questions that you may want to ask yourself. The first is, does the project focus on issues where particular groups in society are excluded or marginalized? So once again, if you're doing an election program, or if you're doing an advocacy project, or if you're doing a media project, are they groups in society that are excluded from that particular area or the particular issue or focus that you have? And if that's the case, then you would then want to target and recruit individuals from that particular group to be involved in the project, right? And even if your project is one like we saw in the previous slide, one where the project specifically targets a particular group, you might be looking at women in society, for instance, or you might be looking at a religious minority group. There are also other differences to consider, right? So whether it's age, disability status, whatever the case may be, right? Because people identities are not just in one area, but people have multiple identities, and so you may also want to then look at that piece as well. Even if, for instance, your project is focusing on women, you may want to look at women who are in a minority religious group, if that happens to be an area where there is exclusion for that group and the project that you'll be working on. The second question that you would want to ask yourself in terms of project design is, will the project help reduce gaps between dominant groups and marginalized groups, right? And so at a minimum, will the intervention do no harm? In other words, will it not sort of widen the gap that we see in terms of inclusion for dominant groups and marginalized groups, or that it will not reinforce those inequalities or marginalization that is present. So two important questions to ask yourself as you're designing your project, to help you to get at this goal of social inclusion for marginalized groups. Now, here are a couple ways that as you're designing your programs can be inclusive. One is to focus on beneficiaries. The second is to focus on content, right? So you can look at the number or proportion of people in the program that are directly served by the program. For instance, the number or percent of LGBT persons who are trained, for instance, to document violations of rights, right? So if you have a project where you're helping people to be able to document rights infringements, right? This, may be an approach that you take in terms of, who it is you're actually training to be able to do this work. The other is in terms of the content, right? And here it might be more for a project that is not specifically targeting a particular marginalized group, but is looking at the general population. And here now you want them to focus on an issue that directly relates to marginalization issues, right? So for instance, then the program objectives or the activities would address issues, for that group. Keep in mind, of course, that inclusion doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking over the project objectives or that the project objectives need to change. You can still be doing, a program that's focusing on media and media awareness, or, a program that's focusing on advocacy, but then you are looking at who the beneficiaries are and bringing them in. It doesn't necessarily have to change the actual objective of the program for there to be efforts for inclusion. Some strategies for inclusion-focused programming that you may want to consider are the following. In terms of building participation of marginalized groups into the project, you can look at the objectives, you can look at the targets, you can look at activities, and then also you're going to want to have indicators that help you to figure out how well you're doing that. You may decide to partner with local organizations that have trust and credibility with the marginalized group as a way to help you to design an intervention that will increase the inclusion of those groups. You can work with communities directly and other local partners. You can consult with people from marginalized groups to get a sense of what their needs, their priorities, and this is the kind of thing that you would want to do before you do the program design so that that information can be included in the design, or that the design is then informed by this information. You can conduct analysis on the particular group's needs, their priorities, or what are the barriers that they have to participation, and then some of the program design and activities that you would develop would be designed to address those barriers that you've identified. And then, of course, think beyond women and youth. As part of the analysis that we've been doing, we found that a lot of the programming that has been done over the past 5-6 years has done a really good job of focusing on women and focusing on youth, but not so much for some of the other marginalized groups, religious and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities in particular. Our analysis is showing has been an area where many of the implementing partners that we've been interviewing have found really difficult to do, and then also questions, particularly concerns about doing programming with LGBTI communities, and particularly in countries where either it's a taboo subject or where they could be security concerns. But of course, these are where we find that they are these marginalized groups, and so to some extent, if we're going to have effective democracy and rights programming, we have to find creative ways to include these groups in the work. Wanted to share with you an example of a good practice. DRL funded a project to promote women's perspectives in media in the Great Lakes region in Africa. And the grantee noticed that although they were able to, through recruitment and targeting, as we talked about earlier, increase the percentage of female journalists, they found that the media content still was not changing. To address recruiting female journalists in the first phase of the project, they conducted a baseline study for the region. They looked at 3 of the countries that they were focusing on. I believe it was Burundi, Rwanda, and and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. They carried out barriers analysis, which is an approach that looks at what are some of the constraints to inclusion that marginalized populations face. And so they were looking at what were the obstacles that were restricting female media participation and the coverage of gender issues. For instance, in the DRC, they found that social attitudes towards women's journalists was not very accommodating. Women who worked in this field were seen by the general public as promiscuous or immoral. People also tended to think that women were less suited for field reporting work than males were. In Rwanda, they found that domestic duties were a hindrance to media work, so that sort of like work-life balance thing. People sort of looking at women's roles really being in the household and not out in the public sphere. In Burundi, the lack of women's decision-making power in the household and at work had an impact in terms of, being able to recruit women to be journalists. In addressing the second piece in terms of media content, what the grantee did is they then had a radio station grants competition for gender-sensitive programming as a way then to begin to have more, women's perspectives and women's focus in the media programming that was being done in the region. Now, once you have, designed the program, then you're going to want to, for it to include marginalized populations, then you're going to want to monitor and evaluate how well you're doing that. And a couple of ways to do that is to disaggregate data. The second is to conduct baseline data assessment. So looking at factors like sex, age, disability status, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation as ways to disaggregate some of the data that you have about participants so that you can get a sense of who you're targeting and then, cross-tabulate that with, responses they may have about how well the program is working. And then also collecting baseline data. So you know where you started and then you have, some information on, what impact, or what has changed from the interventions that you have used. Where possible, you're going to want to use inclusive sensitive indicators. You're going to want to compare the differences between the marginalized and the dominant population. You're going to want to look at changes over time to see if the gaps are closing. Some examples would be percent of population who indicate awareness of key issues that people with disabilities face, the number or percent of political leaders or civil society organizations involved in dialogues and issues affecting ethnic minorities may be some possible indicators. Finally, I want to go over another quick example. DRL founded a program in Malaysia, trained about 222 citizen journalists to do video news production. The goal of the project was to promote ethnic and religious tolerance and respect for human rights. Some of the indicators that were used to measure that included the percent of videos produced that focus on human rights or religion or ethnic relations, changes in citizen journalist attitudes themselves in terms of, doing work on human rights, religion, or ethnic relations, and then finally action by the government or religious and ethnic leaders taking in response to the videos or news produced by the citizen journalists. So you see also that the indicators are at different levels in terms of different outcomes for the project. In conclusion, inclusion matters in democracy, rights, and labor work, and it promotes equality as well as empowerment. Programming for inclusion involves a focus on targeting particular beneficiaries, but then also looking at program content. Barrier analysis is a really good way to identify issues, challenges, and opportunities for inclusive programming, and using inclusion indicators help you to determine the effectiveness and impact of the program that you are implementing on marginalized populations. Thank you very much. And I think that I have a few minutes to answer some questions, or have I used all my time? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I can stick around.
There will be a networking session afterwards.
Okay, great. So I'll be around, and so you can ask me a few questions. I have my card and stuff. We can connect, beyond this session as well. Thank you so much for having me.